So continuing, Yahshua spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad, and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at the feasts, the best seats in synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But you, do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Messiah, and you are all brethren. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, the Messiah. But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies it? Therefore, he who swears by the altar, swears by it, and by all things on it. He who swears by the temple, swears by it, and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven, swears by the throne of Elohim, and by him who sits on it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done, without leaving the others undone. Blind guides, who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first cleanse the inside of the cup and dish, that the outside of them may be clean also. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so, also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Therefore, you are witnesses against yourselves, that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up, then, the measure of your father's guilt. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Therefore, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous bloodshed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you are not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of Yahweh. For those that falsely like to come and say that Yahshua never spoke against people or rebuked people, they're just not reading their Bibles. Because if you read this passage, Yahshua is really giving it to these Pharisees. He is really calling them out. The Pharisees were an extremely hypocritical group. If you didn't recognize this before from the other times Yahshua spoke about them, you definitely should get the picture now. His rebuke of the Pharisees can be placed on many false teachers of our now modern times. The hypocritical things that the Pharisees did, we see often within our modern day church. You should use this passage of scripture when reviewing your church and pastors. This can be a very difficult thing to come to terms with because many people don't want to review their pastors and church leadership and be critical of them. They feel like it's judging. But Yahshua is pointing out the hypocrisies. Understand, the Pharisees were in charge of teaching the people, but instead of helping the people understand more about the Father, they fed themselves and placed those who follow them against Yahweh by murdering his Son. They were compromised with the world and brought judgment against Israel in the end. If you do not review your church organization, the doctrine they teach you, and the fruit they produce, it's very possible that they are doing the same thing to you that the Pharisees did to the Jews. Instead of placing you in the will of the Father, they have placed you in direct opposition of the Father. This goes for those under leadership in Christian churches and those under leadership in Hebrew Israelite camps. Read this passage that Yahshua is speaking and ask yourself, could this be your pastor and church organization? There's also a portion in this passage that seems to get overlooked. When Yahshua says, "Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven," he is not talking about your parent, but your spiritual father. This seems to be something that is overlooked by the Roman Catholic Church and practicing Catholics. They give their priest the title Father, clearly ignoring what Yahshua has told them not to do. Matter of fact, this whole passage can be tied to the Roman Catholic Church and their many hypocrisies. Even the Pope is shown to be a hypocrisy of this scripture. If you speak with practicing Catholics, please show them this passage of scripture and show them how their church is ignoring this instruction. Now there is one section in these scriptures that is often misused. When Yahshua says, "Woe to you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done, without leaving the others undone." People like to often use this scripture that because Yahshua told the Pharisees to tithe, that means we should be tithing as well. This misuse of scripture stems from a lack of context and understanding. Now I have a video dedicated to tithing, so if you do not understand this, you should watch the video. But the tithe was a requirement for the children of Israel. Numbers chapter 18, verse 21 says, "Behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tithes in Israel as an inheritance in return for the work which they perform, the work of the tabernacle of meeting." As well as verse 26 says, "Speak thus to the Levites, and say to them, when you take from the children of Israel the tithe, which I have given you from them as your inheritance, then you shall offer up a heave offering of it to Yahweh, a tenth of the tithe." You see, the tithe was meant to support the Levites, who do not receive an inheritance of land like the other tribes, so they were not able to raise their own crops and support themselves. They were the priests, spread amongst all the tribes. The 12 tribes were responsible for supporting the Levites through their tithes. There were, of course, Levites still amongst the Jews during the times of Yahshua, and everyone was still required to tithe to them. So this is why Yahshua told the Pharisees that they should still tithe. When the church tithes today, they are not supporting the Levites. They're supporting pastors and organizations. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with supporting them, but it's not meant to be done by tithing. Tithing is a very specific thing done to support the Levites. Our support should be done through offerings, giving what the Ruach HaKodesh has placed on your heart. Tithes and offerings are two entirely different things. The churches teach tithing, and it's just out of context. When explaining this point to others, many like to bring up the point that Abraham tithed to Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14. And while Abraham did tithe to Melchizedek, that was not a commandment, but an example of a tithe. And even if you decide that you want to follow that example, it should never be taught as an obligation, which still makes it an offering. The point is, scripture must always be used in context. Just because you see a word that matches with your point, you still must use the word in context. You should always support the church, but it is never a burden and something commanded. If you are led by the Ruach HaKodesh, he will guide you into how you should provide your offerings. Don't let anyone use this passage from Yahshua out of context with you.